It's almost springtime and you know what that means, right? Homeowners will be dragging that nasty mower out from their sheds to try and cut down all the weeds, only to find out that it will not start, get impatient, and then push it out to the curb so they can go out and buy a new one. And that's when you happen to be driving by, see that it's being given away, and pick up someone else's trash. In today's video, we're going to be taking a second look at this Murray lawnmower. And the problem is that I was told by the person giving it away that it won't start despite having fresh fuel in it. And from what they told me, it's been in storage for at least a year. And there's a really good chance they left fuel in it and this is the result of it. So on these newer Briggs engines, the main fuel jet has a tendency to close up with buildup if fuel is left in it for a long time. And by the way this mower looks with last year's grass clippings still in place, it's certainly possible that's what's happened here. And even though the grass clippings are not going to get in our way, we'll take care of that off camera. Now, since we've never seen this mower before, it'd be a good idea to check on the oil level and its condition. The good news is that there's plenty of oil in the engine, also the condition is surprisingly good too. Of course, they also mentioned that there was plenty of fresh gasoline in it, but we'll inspect that later on after we try and start it. So it turns out they weren't lying about it not starting. Now I have to wonder if there's anything else that's wrong with it. And after checking the air filter and seeing that it's quite dirty, it now makes sense why there's still a lot of grass clippings sitting on the mowing deck. We'll just move some of it away from the intake since we'll be starting it without the air filter. So that's kind of interesting. Once we got it started using fresh gasoline, it kept running on what was in the fuel system. So I guess we'll need to drain the fuel tank and see what that fuel looks like now. If it is kind of old and stale, it would make sense that it may not have enough punch to get the engine started. So this gasoline is not what I would call fresh, but it's not that old either. And if I did have to guess, I'd say it's from last season, and that's why it has some color to it. So here's what I'm struggling with. I could just replace the gasoline, prime the carb again, and then let the fresh fuel make its way to the carb. Or I can take the carb off and give it a good cleaning and inspect it at the same time. One way would save me a lot of time, and of course that would save me a lot of money. But the other way would give me peace of mind, especially since I intend on selling it. That's the reason I'm choosing to take off the carb for cleaning and inspection. Now you don't have to do it this way, but of course that is your choice to make. However, it would also be something to include in your ad when you go to try to sell it. There is another possible reason why this engine didn't start for us, and that is a non-working choke. The choke flap is supposed to be closed when starting the engine cold and then open once it's running. And as you can see, the choke flap is closed just like it's supposed to be and is not stuck either. The part you're looking at is a thermostat that's attached to the muffler which will bypass the choke when the engine is hot. If for some reason you can't get it to start when cold but you can prime it with fuel and get it started, then you might want to look at the choke flap to see if it's stuck open. And after prying the post for the thermostat bypass off the carb, we can then carefully work the carb free from the governor linkage. I almost forgot, you can pour out the fuel from the bowl just by turning it on its side. And to be honest, I thought it was going to look worse than this, but instead it just looks like what came out of the fuel tank. What sometimes happens is that the fuel tank will be dry, but the carb might still have last year's gasoline in it. Then you'll add your fresh gasoline to the fuel tank, not realizing the stuff in the carb is going to keep it from starting. And after prying the bowl free from the carb, what we find is the same gasoline, but there is a chance water might be in it. And what I typically do is pour it out and see if I can spot the water droplets. But after doing that, what we see is nothing. So what would it look like if there was water in the bowl? Well, here's what it would look like. And as you can tell, it didn't look like this until I poured a small amount of water on it. That means water in the fuel was not the problem here, but a partially clogged fuel jet might explain it. There's just one problem, and that is the fuel jet looks about as clear as it should be. The only thing left to do now would be to take out the white cartridge from the carb and inspect it for some kind of clog. And once it's out, we'll then carefully separate it, that way we can inspect all the openings. And what we're looking for is any one of the many openings to have dirt or debris on it, and guess what? That's exactly what we find. What we end up finding is a tiny jet that's packed with debris. We'll then clean out the debris using some wire, but compressed air will work as well too. We'll then check that all the other tiny openings are clear as well, and of course we'll then do the same for the main jet just to make sure. I don't know if you can tell, but after using the wire, the opening in the fuel jet looks exactly the same as before. So this carb really wasn't in bad shape at all, so there was no need to give it a lot of extra attention. But if it was really bad, we would have used a lot of carb cleaner on it. I do have to admit that having a carb made out of plastic allows you to not have to worry about corroded metal parts. But plastic parts have their cons as well, besides being cheap to make. Also, before you install the carb back onto the engine, make sure this O-ring and its plastic retainer are in place. These two items are the only things helping to seal the backside of the carb to the intake system. And if you do forget them, the engine might be tough to start, and if it does start, it might not run well at all. Next, carefully work the carb onto the governor linkage and then seat the carb to the intake. Then you'll need to install the post for the thermostat bypass and make sure that it works like it's supposed to. Also, do not forget to connect the emissions breather hose to the backside of the air filter base. And if you do happen to forget, unfiltered air will get through the carb and go into the engine, wearing it out. I know some viewers are going to ask about installing a fuel filter on the fuel line. And my take on it is, yes, you could if you wanted to, but there's not a lot of room for one. It really depends on what kind of fuel filter you want to install, but most times I don't even bother. And that's because inside the fuel tank at the very bottom, right at the outlet, there's an integrated fine mesh screen. This is more than enough to capture grass clippings or debris that might get inside the fuel tank. No, it's not going to help out with dirt, but you would need a paper filter for that, and that's never going to fit on this fuel system. The best advice I could give you is to keep the fuel cap area clean, that way it'll keep dirt from falling into the tank. There are special types of fuel filters that might fit in that space, but I don't think they're going to be cheap. And after doing a bit of wheel maintenance to keep them working well, we'll then put the mower back onto the ground and then try starting it. So it did take a couple of pulls, but it finally started and ran. The best part is the self-propel works and the engine sounds great. So what exactly was causing this engine not to start before? I don't know if you noticed it, but I did put the old fuel back into the mower that I took out. That means the problem was not the fuel, despite it having a bit of time on it. Was it really just the one jet in the cartridge that was keeping it from starting then? I really couldn't say, but considering that it's now starting and running compared to what it was doing before, I'd say yes. That brings up another question about how that jet even got covered in the first place. Well, that's pretty easy. That jet sits in the airway in the carb, which means any dirt that gets by the air filter could clog that jet. And seeing how this mower was covered in grass clippings, the air filter was doing its best, but it's probably the original one and wasn't doing a good job anymore. Basic maintenance is key to keeping your machine working like it should, and this one seems to be another victim of neglect. So my question is, how often should you replace the air filter? It might still look good after cleaning, but at some point, it's going to start fitting like old underwear. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.